There we go. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host, Liam, aka Himvar. And today I'm doing another, what I normally call my chatting series, where they're generally authors. They come on and are nice enough to chat about their works. It has been a while, actually. The last one was with Scott Odin almost a year ago. And Today, though, we have a new author, one I'm excited to talk to and talk about some of his works. Is, of course, Dariel Quiogue, or Dariel R.A. Quiogue, and author of, well, actually, of some Sword and Planet stuff, also some um, historically inspired sword and sorcery. And I believe you also do work in like RPGs somehow. Um,
Yes, I do. Yeah.
and but one of the reasons we're doing this now and not some other time actually is because there's a crowdfunding campaign going on for one of Dariel's works, um, Walls of Shira Yulun. Is that how you say it? I should have asked you first.
Um, well, I pronounce it Yulun, but
Yulun.
I guess anything goes.
Okay. Yulun. Now that makes sense. Actually, in my video, I think my review, because I've already reviewed this. I started out saying Yulun, I think, and then throughout the video,
Hmm.
I think I changed it to Yulun.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I've noticed
um,
that change.
so, so I'm
No
always second
problem.
guessing myself. And then, but that's it's interesting with different languages, just how the pronunciation. Because I think in English, if it was an English word, you'd probably say Yulun. But it's not
Hmm.
an English word, obviously. So, but um, so, anyways, but there's a novella by Dariel that is being crowdfunded on BackerKit right now. I will have that link in the description. Um, Walls of Shira Yulun, or Yulun again, sorry. And also, interestingly, is being crowdfunded with another novella in like kind of a double feature, um, uh, which is Waste Flowers by Bryn Hammond. Um, I've read both. I have reviews for both if y'all want to go check those out. But today we're going to talk about that novella, and we're also going to just talk about that character that stars in the novella, and just some other things. So, is there anything else you want to say about yourself before I just ramble off? So,
Oh well, you've pretty much said the important stuff. I'm a writer and a photographer, and those two kind of feed each other because what I see when I take photos or when I'm looking for inspiration also inspire my writing, and I take breaks from photography by writing and vice versa.
oh, nice. Yeah, I mean that's pretty interesting. So, do you what do you mostly photograph? Is it like wildlife, like landscapes, or
I
people?
wish I had the gear to photograph wildlife, but that would cost as much as my house,
Oh, okay.
given the local currency. So I photograph mostly landscapes, travel photos, food,
Okay.
um, portraits with my wife when we are hired.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, I shoot people for a living sometimes.
The nice kind of shooting, I guess. So,
Yes. They
okay.
usually survive it.
They usually survive. That's good. But there might be a little awkwardness, I guess, in the process. I'm always very awkward when I get my photo taken, but they always look nice in the end, though, and I like having the photos. So, but
Well, same actually. I can't relax in front of the camera.
oh yeah. Do you
Yeah,
relax behind the camera though? Are you good there?
I'm very relaxed behind the camera.
Okay, that's
In
good.
front of the camera, okay.
Right. So that brings to mind, I guess, to me. So I know not authors, photographers, when they take photos, they go and they work on those photos, or just I don't really know all of it. I didn't honestly take any photography class or anything like that ever. But as a writer, when you write, I'm curious, kind of, in particular, maybe for this novella, from like concept or like beginnings of like writing to like finished products, like what's that process like normally for you?
For me, okay, my process is um, I will usually start by looking for a general premise, a quick hook, something that I can spin a one sentence summary of. Like, for example, Orhan is trapped in a besieged city. Okay,
Mm.
so there's a base. Now let's expand. Where is this city? Why is he there? All right. So basically, you ask yourself the is it the four W's or the five W's? Who, what, when, where, why,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So why is he there? Who is he interacting with? What are his problems there? You always have to look for the hero's problem so that you can spin a story out of that. And then you start digging deeper. And I would actually say I write a lot of my stories in a world first perspective. Setting is
Mhm.
very important to me. Um, so in this case, since it's a historically inspired piece, I knew that it would be about the Central Asia or the Central Asian border of China. So I started researching the histories of those places. I started researching also the visuals, um, and those let me spin off some plot hooks. And then I also studied, with the help of Bryn, Mongolian shamanism, because as soon as I realized that I wanted a sorcerer hunting Orhan, I thought that since the sorcerer would be outside the walls, why not make him a Central Asian, a Mongol,
Mhm.
who is siding with his eternal rival, Jungar? So I believe you've explained the basis of who and what Orhan is in your review. So
Mhm.
do you want to go over that again, or can we just base from that?
I mean, very quickly, he's kind of like a right. He's like, what if Genghis Khan was, uh, well, kind of kicked off his, little seat. So,
Correct, correct. And Genghis Khan had an ally and a blood brother, a sworn brother.
Mhm.
The Mongols call it Anda, and that the name of that guy was Jamuka. And in my version, it's Jungar. And Jungar hires a shaman to actually the shaman kind of recommends himself, and they hunt Orhan together, or rather, the shaman goes hunting Orhan for him.
Mhm.
So that required me, because I really do not want to just resort to what I call point and zap magic, you know, the most D&D kind of magics. So let's avoid that and make it more mysterious, make it darker by having some more culturally informed forms of magic in there. So I knew I
Mhm.
had to research Mongolian shamanism, and for that, since I really couldn't find good resources online, I asked for Bryn's help, and she forwarded me some scholarly papers on that. So
Wow.
where were we? Okay, so that was nailing down the concept,
Mhm.
and then once the concept was there, the foundations were there, I could start spinning off more characters and more plot beats because I knew what the world was like. I knew what the setting was like.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, I think the usual advice for writers is to start with the character first,
Mhm.
but I actually start with setting first. Well, of
Okay.
course, that was easier because this character is a series character, so that's a given. But
Right.
even with the very first Orhan story, um, Lord of the Brass Host, it actually did also start with a setting or a setting
Mhm.
inspired idea, the Terracotta Army in Xi'an.
Mhm.
Oh, by the way, don't worry about the pronunciation of place names like Yulun, because whatever we do, we won't get it right anyway. Chinese is a tonal language, and I am
Okay.
tone deaf, so don't rely on me for that.
No, that's some that yeah. Thanks, I guess. But no, yeah, that's very interesting, actually, very intriguing. So character, well, setting, I think, in a sense, then you could I feel like it would maybe not be too inaccurate to describe setting as character, in a
I
sense
believe
too,
so.
right?
Yes. In
Okay.
fact, when I write Sword and Planet, I say the planet is a character.
Yeah. I mean that's one thing I really like when so some of the sword I really like sword and sorcery in general, right? And sword and planet, I guess too. Uh and when we get to when I get to reading sword and sorcery, right? Um I like uh I like my blood and thunder. I like it when I guess it's simple, and just some beefy barbarian killing some evil sorcerer or monster or whatever, right? And that's fine. You know what I mean? But I also really like it when it feels like there's a little bit more to it than that, right? I mean, like that's all fine and dandy. I've also read it 100 times, right? So I mean, like,
Hmm.
and I think you can keep a lot of it, but change the, I guess the word vibe, maybe the vibe of it a lot, right? I mean, you're going to keep that sense that sword and sorcery has, that the spirit of sword and sorcery, or the attitude, as some might put it. Um, but you're going to have, well, variety, I think, and
Yeah.
I think that's one thing that I really like about the Orhan stories is it. And even compared to, say, like the goatskin stories, which are also Mongolian inspired, right? That they feel very different than the other sword and
Hmm.
sorcery I've read, right? And but when I read it, I don't think this isn't sword and sorcery, right? I think this is sword and sorcery, and I like this flavor of it. Um, and I think the first Orhan story I actually read was, I believe, here in New
Curse of the
Edge,
Horsetail Banner. There. Yeah.
right? Yes.
Nest
Um,
Zero.
yeah, this came out 2 years ago almost, I think now.
Hmm.
Um, and then also we have some stuff here. So this is actually
Hmm.
this I think cover
Yeah,
art.
yeah.
So
I got a cover story for that one.
yeah, that's
So
very
yeah,
cool.
that was fun.
So very cool. And then this is a collection of some of the Orhan stories as well.
Hmm.
Um, and I guess one thing that I know we're largely talking about Orhan here. He seems to have been a character I feel like I've seen him appear in a lot of of the sword and sorcery publications out there. Um, but as is common with sword and sorcery, I would argue you don't have to read it in a certain order. So, I mean, could readers read
Yes.
this novella easily first?
Yeah, I purposely wrote all the Orhan stories so that a new reader can jump in at any point, can jump in on any story, and if they like it, then they can take a look at the other ones. But every story stands on its own.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
as you read them, you will start to realize that there is a definite timeline going on. That I actually have Orhan's career in mind, and I needed to order the stories for my own sake because I didn't want continuity errors when I was writing.
Uh-huh. Right. Okay, that makes sense. So, do you have like a scheme of like, um, I'm thinking something like Far from the Grey Mouser, right? Where you could read those like first 5 books in like really any order and it wouldn't matter, right? But then like book 6 and 7, you should read, well, in that order, 6 and 7 after the other ones, right? And then it's like a sunsetting like experience for the twain. Do you have an end in mind for Orhan eventually?
Yes, I do have a general idea for that. The specifics, not yet, but I did have him mention in the story that Orlok sounded like a good name for his son. If he ever had one, well, he will have one, and he will be named Orlok, and he will have adventures.
I see, I see. So you can do that um the Adventures of Orlok after Orhan.
Yes.
So, that's exciting. No, and I would say honestly as well, though, having read the novella, that I think, yeah, it would be a very easy place to come in and read Orhan for the first time. Especially a lot of readers, uh, especially in my side of things. I'm on what people call BookTube, and many people on
Hmm.
BookTube don't read a lot of short stories, which is a
Hmm.
shame. But often, if I'm going into somewhere and I need to recommend something, sometimes it's easier to recommend a longer work because a lot of people just prefer that for some reason.
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
so and so it'll be nice. I really like novellas in sword and sorcery,
Hmm.
right? We seem to be getting more of them, at least this year, uh, in the genre. So it's nice to be like, yes, go read this, or whatever, or in
Yeah,
this case,
yeah.
go and support this, campaign, um, and you will be able to read it. So.
I actually am thinking of a an Orhan novel, maybe done as a sort of stitch up,
Mm,
several interconnected short stories, or two or three novellas stitched together by some connective tissue.
mm.
Because I do think, yeah, I agree with you there that novels seem to sell more easily in the current market. But
Yeah.
yeah, that will come in time.
Well,
Yeah, I'm
I
more
look
likely to
forward to
come
it.
to use the stitch up format rather than a single long story
Mhm.
because Sword and Sorcery just really lends itself more to the shorter format.
It really does, yeah, and I think there's ways to, like, uh, kind of wiggle your way even into, like, what a lot of, modern fantasy readers like. I mean, to be honest, like, I'm pretty young for I feel like to generalize for sword and sorcery readers, right? I mean, which I'm trying to make that less of a odd thing, you know what I mean? Via, my channel and whatnot. But um I do um wow, I lost my train of thought there for a second. But
It's
I do
okay.
think that something like, for example, Howard Andrew Jones's uh Hanovar books, for example, they kind
Mm,
of it's kind of a trick almost, it feels like when I read those, because they're thick. They're like a,
mm,
normal, what, like, a lot of people just think of as fantasy books, right? But they don't
mm.
read like that at all. In fact, they read very sword and sorcery-esque, because I would say they are, right?
Yeah, they're very
So,
episodic.
yeah, right, exactly. Um, and I mean, we've had fix-up novels and stuff for, decades, of course. But yeah, I do think I agree with you there that it is definitely seems to work better in shorter form. Um, and but I am curious. What brought you to Sword and Planet, Sword and Sorcery, but also just to like writing in general.
Okay. Um, way back in 1977, I used to raid my brothers and sisters' books because I was already a voracious reader at that time. So I would find their literature primers and history primers, and that introduced me to Herodotus. Um, I also found there an abridged version of the Odyssey, uh, which also led me to reading the Iliad a little later. And that being 1977, that was also the year that Star Wars came out. And then one fateful morning, my sister came home and brought me two books: Edgar Rice Burroughs' Fighting Man of Mars and Conan the Swordsman, the pastiche collection by Bjorn Nyberg, Lynn Carter, and Leon Sprague de Camp. I hope I pronounced that right. Anyway, so
Probably.
that really turned me on to Sword and Sorcery and Sword and Planet. The brain damage was really permanent there. And I thought, hey, this is really cool. I want to do this. Someday I want to tell stories like this.
Oh
So
yeah.
yeah, back in high school and college, I was writing stories, very terrible
Mm,
ones, I think. So I think that growing older and having a much more mature outlook on life helped make me make meatier stories.
okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So for a while you wrote, I guess before you found, like, how long do you think you were writing before you got like your first publication or something?
Hmm. To be honest, I really got the confidence to submit a story only back in 2010 or 2011.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it was the last quarter of 2010 because if I remember correctly, Lord of the Brass Host came out in January or February of 2011 in Heroic Fantasy Quarterly.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was writing on and off from way back when I was around 15 or 16, but I don't think I did anything really good at that time. Or if I did, it's okay, a few scenes are good, but the rest of it isn't there.
Yeah, writing's a interesting beast, I guess. And I definitely write things sometimes. I'm like, wow, I will never publish that. But I mean, I think the
Mhm.
experience of it was like, I think it helped in a way, right? Like, eventually it'll get me to a good story that I could publish, right? So,
Mm. Oh, one thing though is, of course, the stories that I wrote way back then, they were on paper, and those are lost
mhm.
now. I have a terrible allergy to old paper and old wood.
Oh,
But as for my digital files, I keep all of them because, as far as I'm concerned, everything is grist for the mill. So I may have written something terrible way back in the past, but the setting might be something I can cannibalize for something else.
Mm-hmm.
A concept for a character, maybe something I can cannibalize. So I maintain an archive.
Yeah, and I think the cannibalizing your stories uh helps, especially in some ways with inspiration, where it kind of falls together better that way sometimes. So,
Well, Robert E. Howard did it, so I guess it
oh, did
wasn't
he?
wrong.
Okay. Yes, so we can agree on that one then. So, um, and so that is interesting though, that I think that you mentioned uh well, pulp writers
Hmm.
for inspiration. I can see it very obviously. But also things like well, some classics, or even something like Herodotus, which is a history, but it's kind of more
Hmm.
like a literature these days, I guess.
It's a
So
history and a gossip book.
yeah, so um, and do you think that do you still look for both for fiction and for um, I don't know, maybe nonfiction and also like classics? I hesitate to just straight up call like the Iliad fiction. I mean, I know like that's probably an accurate enough label, right? But like
Mhm.
it feels a bit more than that. So do you still look to that stuff, for writing?
Very much so. Very much so. My sources for story ideas lie in histories and mythology, especially non-Western mythologies
Hmm.
and non-Western histories. Um, for fiction, it's often the style that inspires me and the general themes. So for fiction, of course, Robert E. Howard is one of my main inspirations for, especially for pacing and for its visualness. David Gemmell is a very big influence on me. He gave me a taste for more complex, morally complicated, tormented characters. So a darker uh,
Hmm.
look at characters. Um, Lee Brackett is another huge influence. She gave me my taste for the bittersweet ending, uh, the ending where the hero can lose as much as he wins.
Mm-hmm.
You know, uh, very often I notice that in Lee Brackett and the David Gemmell stories, the triumph is often something deeper in a way
Hmm.
than what the hero was after in the first place.
Mm.
So like, okay, you were here to save to gain a treasure, but it ends actually with the hero saving a life,
Hmm.
or in Orhan's case, maybe a city. So things like that.
Yeah. Okay. No, I like that a lot. And I think uh, I I think I mentioned in my review actually. I can see the Gemmel when I saw someone else like mention that at one point. I was like, okay, I can see that in this. And
Mm-hmm.
and Gemmel's a great writer. And even when you mentioned Bracket, I can see that even in just Walls itself. And I think when you mentioned bittersweet endings, I straight to mind comes the Sword of Rionin, which is just
Oh
like
yes.
a great ending. I'm just like I have very fond memories of finishing that book. And I'm like,
Oh
wow,
yeah.
okay, like so.
Yeah, because for me, the ending where the hero, rides off into the sunset with a bag of gold and the girl in his saddle, it's like, okay, we've seen that 1,000 times before, right?
Right.
It's how every D&D adventure ends if the GM isn't an a-hole.
Yeah.
But when you think about it, okay, what stays with you?
Hmm.
It's the grim endings. It's for example, Lord of the Rings.
Hmm.
Where does
Right.
it really end? It does not end with Aragorn becoming king. It
Hmm.
doesn't end with the victory of the Pelennor. It ends with the scouring of the Shire and Frodo going off into the Blessed Isles because he's just too wounded spiritually to go on.
Yeah. No,
This guy
I think
sacrificed, so much to
right.
preserve
No,
what he couldn't hold.
yeah, that's a
But
that's a
yeah.
fantastic point. And I think actually that's one thing, not to disparage a whole section of fantasy fiction, but I think that's one thing that epic fantasy missed for many years with many writers. I won't say it's all of them, obviously,
Hmm.
right? But that like you read when you read The Return of the King, for example, the book feels like it should finish 100 pages before it does, right? If you want
Hmm.
that type of ending, but then it keeps on going. right? And you have the stuff, and then you get there's one critic who called the last words of Return of the King like the most heartbreaking words ever, right? Like, and because it's super depressing when you read it, it's just like, wow, they won, but I'm sad. So like, so and I think there's good from that. I mean, like in real life, you don't just you don't just go away right off into the sunset with that bag of gold or whatever, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like you live and you learn, you know what I mean? You fall and you succeed sometimes at the same time, right? Like so
Yeah, there's
and
there's no free lunch. Everything has a cost.
right, yeah. And I think that's important. I think that's important to catch. And I think you do a good job with that.
Thank you.
And I think um it's funny. I say I think, and then the thought actually goes away. But so like, I was like, I think, and then it's gone. Anyways, but so, um, sorry. Let me check my notes because I
Mm.
swear I was looking at it just a second ago. um, oh yeah, that's what it was. I think this made you when you were talking, it made me think of this. Do you have like any when you write something? Do you have something like anything like a theme in mind, or do you have just themes in general that you like, or is that too risky of a question?
More of the latter, I think. More of the latter.
Mhm,
I don't really deliberately try to write to a theme.
mhm,
It's more of I write what I like and I write about what I hate.
mm,
I believe that you should tap your deeper passions in what you write. So, like, okay, I hate war. So I'm gonna write about war and, you know, hold up to you a mirror and let you see just how terrible it is.
mm.
So things
Okay.
like that. I hate greed. So you will notice that a lot of my villains have that as one of their motives. So things like that. I write my passions. I don't believe in trying to come up with some grand theme
Mhm.
and then try writing to that and find that suddenly my characters want to do something else.
Yeah, and then when the readers read it, they don't see the theme at all.
Right.
So yeah, but, no, that makes sense, and I think particularly you mentioned the word passion. I think passion is important, right?
Hmm.
When you're reading, something that's one thing I really like about it doesn't always translate to something exciting, but it often does. All right, when I read Robert E. Howard, I can see the passion in his writing and the energy
Mm.
there, right? And it's what really makes Howard's work pop, I think, personally. And one thing I really liked about Walls actually is that it's I mean, you've already talked about it a little bit, you know what I mean, like this premise and like the extra characters and the dark magic even from the that druid.
Hmm.
But also it's really fast. It's really easy to read. Right? Like
Oh,
it's
right.
I know you mentioned in your Q&A with Oliver that you wanted it to end with like an oh crud moment every chapter, right? And
Yeah.
and I think it works. I mean, like I think I'm not. Do you know how many words around it is exactly, or
It's 34,000 something, if I remember correctly.
okay, so it's like on the longer side of a novella, and I still
Hmm.
think it
Hmm.
reads pretty fast. Like it's it's gripping, it's action oriented. Also, you have some nice character
Nice.
work in there, and
Ah,
but it just definitely flows very swiftly. And I think another thing also is that especially reading with try not. I guess I'll try not to spoil it, but Fienne's character. I don't know
yeah,
if
if I
you.
am, yeah.
Yeah, I thought that her like relationship with Orhan was very interesting, and I was like, "Oh, is this gonna happen?" I was like that would be like one thing like a lot of authors would do is like, "Oh, or is this gonna happen?" And like, and in some ways also it just like the relationship it doesn't come off as anywhere near in some sense as maybe slightly I guess if you go back to like some idea of like medieval European chivalry, but besides that, it doesn't really come off as a Western in a sense
Hmm.
really at all, right? I mean, first off, I mean, I guess maybe it wouldn't be a spoiler. She's like one of the wives of an
Hmm.
very an old merchant, I guess.
Right.
And that in itself is this an interesting like situation
Hmm.
to begin it in. So, uh, but yeah, I just so I mean I appreciate the character work there. Especially she's probably my favorite, like not Orhan in the
Okay.
novella. So secondary character, I guess you could say. Um, and yeah, I appreciate how it ends.
Well, I took the inspiration for Fai Yan's character from several movie roles of
Oh
Michelle
really?
Yeoh. Yeah,
Oh okay. Well, I mean, it's good actress at least. So
exactly. So yeah,
yeah.
a great lady. So yeah.
Uh, yeah. All right. So I do have a another question. I guess is well, this is tangential. Kind
Mm.
of. This is more to the crowdfunding in a sense. But have you ever read any Ace Doubles before? Um,
Oh yes. Oh yes.
you
I
have.
used to
Okay.
collect them way back
Oh,
in the
nice.
80s. I would actually have to scour the seedy part of downtown in order to find them, and
Oh, really?
go to the old American Air Base where outside it they would sell the stuff that the servicemen were leaving behind when they were reassigned. So FNSF was quite hard to find
Mm,
back then here in the Philippines. So in order for us to get it, we would really have to scour places for secondhand books. That was practically our only source because the big chains only carried practically Star Trek. You know, you remember there were so many Star Trek novelizations way back then. So interestingly enough, I enjoyed the series, but I never got into the books.
oh,
So the
okay.
stuff I really liked were, of course, the Daw Yellow Spine books and
Hmm.
the Ace Doubles.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess knowing what you write and what you know like to read. I have several of the yellow spines from Daw. I've not been able to lay my hands actually on an Ace Double at all,
Mm.
which is unfortunate. Maybe one day, but so I'll
Well,
keep on
they are
looking for
older.
sure. Yeah, some of these books I get and they're just like falling apart, but it's still nice to have them. It's like,
Mm,
hey,
true,
this is
true.
a and a lot of them are still really good stories, of course, right? So, and I think that is one thing maybe that actually people have like a when like they have this. Speaking of old, when they think of something like Sword and Sorcery, Sword and Planet, they're thinking of stories that are either 100 years or older, or almost 100 years old. Oftentimes, not always. All right, and they might think that's old fashioned in a sense. For me personally, I find it actually surprising how well Sword and Sorcery works. Today, obviously. But if someone were watching this that doesn't really read Sword and Sorcery and might be afraid, even of like the stories being the genre itself being outdated, or the stories themselves maybe being like shallow, like it doesn't have
Hmm.
the world building of epic fantasy or something, right? Like what would you say to that? I guess if I could put you on the spot there. So,
That's interesting. Okay. Um, well, I really have a taste for historically grounded and mythologically grounded sword and sorcery.
mhm,
Um, I believe that the authors who actually take pains to dig deeper into source material, like I know Howard Andrew Jones and Scott Oden are very much into the classics, and
mhm,
pretty much so am I. Um, I think the new reader will be rewarded with stories that are much more complex and more interesting than you know, they might initially believe. Um, Good stuff for me is timeless. Sword and sorcery is for me a very affirmative form of literature that affirms human indomitability. Because really, that's the core value of every sword and sorcery hero. If you look at it, uh, in the end, it's about indomitability. Conan, Elric, Kull, Kane, Orhan. It's all about not giving in even when the odds are really bad, and that's a lesson
mhm,
that we can use in life, right? So
mhm,
for me, it's affirmative, even though the stories can be very dark.
mhm,
And for me, also history as a background is feels undervalued. Because really, if you look at it, history, shave off two letters and it becomes story, right? History is the story of us. It's the story of humankind. And
Hmm.
it's such a rich narrative that you can tap for endless source material. I mean, uh, I remember chatting with Oliver about a certain detail in the siege, and he said, "Oh, what Asian general came up with that?" Actually, I came up with it on my own, but the idea was based off Genghis Khan's tricks because you can never really get weirder in fiction than you can get in real life. Like the idea of putting gunpowder on domesticated animals and sending them running at the enemy walls or gate. That's historically happened. That really happened.
Yeah, I think no, that was I like that scene. Anyways, but I do I think I'll agree with you there. Actually, I think that the history is a wild source. I think like it's especially since it's there's so much of it, right? Like you can go you could take the pretty, I guess, very highly read stuff. Like you mentioned earlier, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, Herodotus. I mean, that's at least in the West, that's like highly highly saturated. The school system highly saturated with all that, right? You know what I
Right.
mean? Um, but you could still go more in depth with that, and then even if you wanted to go to something else, right? There's a lot. In fact, there's an endless amount.
Hmm.
Obviously, you know what I mean. So like you would never be able to devour it all, right? And I agree with you. I think it's you can take something that has happened historically or something close at least, and then you can play with it or just use it whole cloth almost, and it almost always is still entertaining. It might not have been written like in the most entertaining fashion ever when you're reading about it in like the history or whatever. I
Hmm.
mean, it depends on what it is exactly. But in fiction, we can make it as cool as it actually is, right? I mean,
Exactly.
like
You can make it come
so,
alive.
right? Yeah.
And yeah. Okay, I was going to say. Now it's my turn to say. I was going to say something, but I forgot.
Look at that.
Okay, what
We're
was
in
it?
the
What
same
was
club
it
now.
about history? Yeah, but it's along that track of saying, yeah, that when you retell history in a fictional manner, you can really mine a lot from it. You can get a lot from it. One thing that amuses me, since I've read quite a bit of military history, is when an author takes a historical battle and uses it as his template for describing a fictional battle, and it becomes almost like a game. Like, oh, this is the battle of blank. That's a lot of fun.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's very, very. I think that can be fun. Yeah, and I think it's interesting because you could. There's so many battles in reality, right? That have
Yeah.
happened. So like it's like uh, a very big pool to pull from, as
Hmm.
well. So, um, yeah. No, I
Yeah,
think
like Tolkien based the
mm,
Battle of the Pelennor Fields on the historical Battle of Chalons. Chalons?
mm.
Chalon.
If it's French, who knows? Anyways, no, I was kidding. But so even though I took French for a couple of years. But anyways, so but yeah, no, and I think the cool thing actually, not just and this is kind of what I mentioned earlier, when you get some history really is in some ways really close to literature anyways, right? Because if you read something like Geoffrey of Monmouth, for example, right? He's
Hmm.
writing a history.
Hmm.
It's definitely not a history for the most part. You know what I mean? And so, like, we
Yeah.
pretty much call it literature these days. I think it's safe to call it that. You know what I mean? But he wrote it as a history, right? I mean, so like, but even the stuff that's more strictly historical, like a chronicle, like you read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles and talks about like fiery serpents. One year, right? And so it's just like it's just like okay,
Mm.
interesting, right? And so like, so there's obviously some different stuff going on, but I think you can pull so much from even like tiny things, like and just like and you can go and find weird if for example Tolkien
Mm.
he'll call Numenor Westerness, right? Or
Mm.
Westernessa or whatever, I guess depending on how you say it. and he pulled that from a medieval romance called
Mm-hmm.
King Horn, right? And these days, who the heck reads King Horn? Like, no one's reading King
Mm.
Horn, right? The book was
Mm-hmm.
written 800 years ago. Like, why would you read that? Like, I've read it actually, but and it's actually still entertaining. But and so, and I think most readers though they're never gonna realize that, but they're still gonna think, oh, that's a fancy dancy name you got there, Tolkien or whatever. Like, so like,
Mm-hmm.
um, and um, in fact, that kind of the idea of Western itself is kind of in that story. And so, and it works really well in Tolkien, right? I mean, like Rings of Power is on right now.
Mm.
Numenor doesn't have a bright future, but and so, and but it's something I think that he grabbed that um, I, I I would wager not really any other authors probably grabbed, and so I'm sure there's things that you've looked at that you're like, hey, I could use this, whether it was conscious or subconscious at the time you're
Mm-hmm.
reading it, I don't know, that you could use, right? I mean, in a sense that these stories, they're kind of like patchwork, right?
Mm.
Patchwork of a lot of different stuff. It's all the stuff you've read before. You mentioned in the Q&A actually, it's it's a patchwork of not just literature though, which we have a tendency to kind of restrict the literature to of being a patchwork of past literature. But you mentioned like Mountain Blade Warband, and you mentioned even
Mm-hmm.
like television.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, like heck, I came out with a novella a few days ago actually, and I'm terrible at advertising. But if I had to do the what is it? It's this verse meets this or whatever. I was like, it's the Northman meets Ghost in the Shell, which are both movies, I guess. So I mean, like,
Okay, now you
so
got me interested.
so yeah. So I mean, like, I think that's important too, right? That it's not just
Mm.
literature in some weird vacuum. You know what I mean? It's not. It's definitely not an author creating a whole cloth in some weird vacuum. But it's not just
Mm-hmm.
literature that authors pull from either, right? There's lots of things that authors pull from. Um, and so again, I didn't ask you this question in advance or in particular, but is there anything that you are maybe generally inspired by or specifically besides other pieces of literature and stuff?
Yeah, one of the things that got me going and doing the kind of sword and sorcery that I write is the idea of what I call forgotten Asia.
Hmm.
And that's based on the observation that, at least in English language media, you've got a lot of material set in China or
Hmm.
Japan or fictional analogs of them. But the areas from Siberia south to the tip of India and down to the islands of Southeast Asia, from Araby in the west to the borders of China and Central Asia in the east, you've got practically nothing.
You're
So
right.
here I am. I am a Southeast Asian. And hey, this is a very rich playground for me. So it was a great opportunity. And at the same time, it felt like it called for, more exposure.
Hmm. That makes sense. I can
So
appreciate
there you
that. And
are.
so, I just a thought real quick. I've read I read a couple books by T.R. Napper, who writes cyberpunk. He's from Australia, I think,
Hmm.
and he's set one of his books in Vietnam, which I found refreshing. It
Hmm.
was a good book, anyways. And also, the latest one was set in Macau. Um,
Hmm.
and I was like, okay, well, that's nice. You know what I mean? Like, and it makes sense. He's over in Australia. I guess he's thinking about that. I mean, in the United States, we don't tend to think about really much of anything besides the United States. And so, sadly, but you're right. I mean, like, I was thinking about that the other day. I was like, this is probably somewhere over in like Kazakhstan, but I kind of forgot about that country for a second. And so like, and which is a shame. Like I shouldn't
Hmm.
forget about it. But to be honest, like I don't think about Samarkand or or
Hmm.
even in Waste Flowers, there's uh, Tongut or Tingut or whatever. I was like, I'd never
Yeah,
even heard of
Tangats,
that,
yeah.
right? And I was like, or something like sometimes I'll go like prehistory, like some archaeological cultures like the Sintashta and stuff like that. And my thing is like language. So there's like the Tocharian speaking peoples over in Western China, like
Hmm.
Tarim Basin, which I think is really cool. But at the same time, I don't know literally any literature about either of those things. And
Hmm.
so like, I've read like one book about the Hittites, for example. So like, and that's way further west, of course. But and so I can understand that, I guess, and I think that's something to appreciate as well. Not just because it's ooh cool exotic flavor, I guess, or whatever. I mean, it. I guess it is that in a sense to most English speakers, but
Hmm.
it's also human. You know what I mean? And
Hmm.
human in a maybe in a form that most people aren't that familiar with, or it's been largely forgotten, or whatever. Um, so yeah, I appreciate that. Anyways.
Yeah, well, for me, I'm kind of a traveler in that sense that, hey, I get to go there sort of in spirit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes
Because,
sense.
well, actually, I've never really seen Central Asia. What I have seen, the closest I've seen is the Himalayas from Kashmir, but
Mm,
that's, but at least it really inspired me because, okay, these landscapes are really amazing. The people
mm-hmm.
are really amazing. And when you get to look at the history of the place, it's like, oh, this is so rich. I got to live for a year in India, and one of the things that struck me, several things struck me, and a lot of this also fed into Orhan Timur and the writings of my other sword and sorcery stories. Is number one is we weren't taught this in school, but I was struck by the sheer amount of Sanskrit words in my language. Okay, so here's India, here's my country. They are thousands of miles apart, and yet our language contains so much Sanskrit. Most Filipinos aren't even aware of it, and it's not taught in school. Okay, but here we are. There's a strong historical link. Uh, and then the other one that struck me was that living in Delhi as we were, uh, I was exposed a lot to Mughal cuisine, Mughal architecture, Mughal
Mm-hmm.
arts, and the history. And I became aware that, hey, these were descendants of the Mongols. And while it seems that so many people think of the Mongols as barbarians, as a faceless
Mm-hmm.
horde of, screaming vandals, basically. And yet, okay, let's look at their palaces, let's look at their art, and spectacular. They're spectacular. So, hey, these aren't simple barbarians. I want to find out more about them. And very luckily, I found a copy of Harold Lamb's Babur the Tiger in a bookshop beneath the walls of the Red Fort in Delhi. And oh, it was very intriguing to read that. And okay, this is what Babur did. This is where he came from. And then look up, and oh wow, his descendants achieved that.
Huh. That's yeah. That is a see that's kind of going to the history thing we were talking about earlier, right? That like
Mm,
these things that inspire. You mentioned Harold Lamb as well too, and I
mm,
think when you at the beginning of Walls, it very much invoked Harold Lamb for me.
mm,
I haven't even read a bunch of Harold Lamb, but like I don't know for some reason I was like yeah I could yep I can feel that. So like um but no, that's very interesting actually, and you got me really intrigued with the Sanskrit thing there. I was like,
mm.
huh, okay, I would not have guessed. I mean, I guess it makes sense in some sense, you know what I mean? But like, I wouldn't have guessed. And so now I'm intrigued, and I'll probably go look it up afterwards. But so like,
Yeah,
uh,
it's amazing just how networked ancient Asia was.
mhm. Yeah, no,
So
it's
it was
crazy. I think
something.
how much like the world in a sense is connected, you know, like I mean, the closer you are the more connected obviously, but like but I like to I remember I took a class, humanities class on just Asian humanities in general, but
Hmm.
it was kind of like we talked about earlier, it was very focused on like China and Korea, for the most part, um but we did talk a little bit about which would have been a big thing if we didn't talk about. We talked about Buddhism a little bit in it as
Hmm.
well. That would have been a huge error if we had missed that, obviously. But it was cool to see something like even like Bodhisattva, right, or whatever, and that has like a direct cognate in English, and it's just like Bodh, right? And they sound really similar still. You know what I mean? And they're
Hmm.
like thousands of years separated.
Hmm.
And it's like, oh, that's awesome. You know what I mean? Like they're related, and that's
Yeah.
not even like England is not even anywhere near India. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think that's cool.
Well, yeah. I mean, the Irish word for king was something like re,
Yeah, I
right?
think it is. Yeah.
And Latin is rex,
Mm-hmm.
and in Spain it's rey. When you
Mm-hmm.
go over to the east, you see Raja, Raj,
Mm-hmm.
and guess what? Over here, it's Raja.
Oh.
So
Wow.
yeah,
Okay.
that's how widely the influence spread. Although
It's an important word,
that
king.
ancient Indo-European language.
Yeah, yeah. It's very interesting. I think um that's what I study. I study philology actually, and
Mm,
particularly Germanic stuff because I'm more interested in English, I guess, because I
hmm
speak it natively. But just in general, it's very interesting. Which is why I know about Tocharian A and
hmm
B over in the Tarim Basin. But anyway, but yeah, no, it's very interesting, and I think that though shows, especially since something like Indo-European was spoken probably about 5,000 years ago,
mm,
right? And how far it spread, that just again how closely connected in a sense um, humanity is, but also I think
yeah.
that this fiction can be right. Like I was heck I saw a picture of my friend Tim Timaeus Bloom actually sent me a picture from the Tower of the Elephant a few weeks ago. All right, some
Mm,
artists and and the artist had a Vietnamese name, and I was like, I wonder if this guy's ever written sword and sorcery. Like, I want to read some Vietnamese sword and sorcery all of a sudden, right? Like, I don't even know if any exists, or whatever. But I'm like, but I'm glad, I'm really glad that some Mongolian inspired sword and sorcery exists. Especially, I think it's interesting that you know Genghis Khan is such a, I don't know, like lodestone almost of a
hmm
figure for that. I mean, it makes sense. Okay, I realize that, but I'm like, but it's very interesting still. So
Yeah.
and and honestly, I don't know much about that because when in school here, I mean, I switched states and different states have different education systems pretty much. But I don't remember learning much about Mongolia at all,
hmm
like almost ever. So I guess I did
Yeah. Right.
briefly. The most I learned about it was in one of my classes I took in college, actually. So, and that was still vaguely brief,
hmm
like a week of attention. So,
Yeah. Very interestingly, you could say they were the ones who introduced paper to the West
mm,
because they were the ones who carried paper from China to the West.
mhm,
Uh, they may even have been the ones to introduce gunpowder to the West because by the time they attacked China, gunpowder was already in use, and well, that's
mhm,
you see that in walls of Shira Yulun,
uh-huh.
and a lot of things too. And some say even the Black Plague, unfortunately.
It can't all be good, I guess.
Yep.
So, I guess a paper would be good. Gunpowder would be in the middle somewhere, and the black plate would be bad over here,
Oh yeah.
right? So, like,
And it's interesting because I and this is, I'd say again, this is the value of National Geographic. I forgot to mention that National Geographic is one of my biggest sources of inspiration. And I remember an article in Nat Geo that mentioned that in old Mongolian lore, um, one of the things that they were taught early in childhood was that if the marmots start dying off, get the hell out of there.
hmm,
Because apparently, when the wild rodents start dying off, that's one of the first signs of plague.
hmm. That's good to know. that's, that's actually um I love it when you can find stuff like that and you're like, oh wow, that's like
Yeah,
a small treasure I just found. like
exactly. And
like
it's often these little tidbits of ideas that lead to something bigger. Like, okay, I find an idea that's intriguing in Nat Geo, and then the next thing I'll do is research it more deeply, and that can spin off a story. Like
yeah.
one of my stories that came out in my collection, Swords of the Four Winds. Um, I think it was, yeah, in the Service of the Serpent King. It was based on an old Cambodian legend that the king of Angkor had to spend every night sleeping with a Naga princess because if not, the kingdom might fall. So
Don't
he
want
had to
that.
go leave his palace, go to this temple, spend the night there, come back in the morning. And so that became the seed of a story.
I mean, it's very
And
interesting.
yeah, the thing is, for me, sword and sorcery taps the better kinds of sword and sorcery tap directly into that very rich body of human mythology,
Hmm.
of worldwide mythology, and as well as history. Because actually, like you were mentioning with Joffrey of Monmouth, history and mythology, you can't tell where the two, where the separation is, right?
All right.
Until around what 1300, 1400, 1500,
Gets
right?
a little easier
These
than.
are, they are connected. They are so
Hmm.
tightly interwoven. History, mythology, they're the same thing.
Hmm. And yeah, I mean, they yeah, they both mean story technically in the
Exactly.
etymological
And
point too.
well,
So
for a lot of yeah, for a lot of cultures, their gods were their ancestors.
right, yeah, yeah. It's actually seems yeah, it's interesting actually how common that is throughout human
Yeah.
experience. So, but, um, but anyways, I do want to start wrapping up here actually, but
Okay.
um, I know you well again, I'll have that. I don't want to say Kickstarter, that crowdfunding campaign for the double experience of those novellas um, down in the description. I also put your website, which I believe
Nice.
you use mostly as like a blog
Hmm.
for occasional, well, your releases, I think, right? Um, and I also believe they'll recently, I don't know, a few days ago maybe, you came out with a chronology for the Orhan stories.
Oh yes,
And
yeah.
yeah. So if anyone's interested in that, again, you could start anywhere. Um, but I think that might be, you know, good to have on hand in some sense. So if you want to go read all of them, which I could encourage. I haven't read all of them yet, but I'll get there. So like, but yeah, I do. I appreciate you coming on here. It's nice to be able to talk to authors, get some idea of not beyond just the words on the page, right? I don't imagine you're gonna go, defend a city wall and fight dark sorcery yourself, Dariel. But I
Hmm.
can get a
Hope not.
sense of you, I guess, from your stories. But it's nice to see the person behind the story as well, because you're, especially when you're reading stuff like Sword and Sorcery, which is like often, like you mentioned earlier, very dark. And then you see the guy writing, and he's like the nicest guy ever, and you're like, oh, okay, like, and so it's just like,
Well, we
so
haven't talked about my inner demons yet, but
okay, on the next episode. No, and no, I was kidding. Anyways, now I do appreciate you coming on here. If there's any
I thank you.
closing remarks, if where people can maybe find you specifically, if you want to share, then you can go ahead and do that now. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I'll send over my links,
Hmm.
and well, best place to find my stories right now is in the new Edge of Sword and Sorcery website because they've been publishing quite a few of them. And also, Heroic Fantasy Quarterly has, I think, four of my stories now.
Oh, nice.
So, and well, they were my very first sale. My very first sale was to them. And, well, it's fun to submit to Heroic Fantasy Quarterly because, well, they have a really nice, I would say the editor has, you know, a good sense for collecting a
Hmm.
wide variety of stories. So it's a good place to look for good reads, I think.
No, yeah, I can agree. And sometimes they collect some and put them in a physical release. But besides that, I think it's normally free to read on their website. So.
Yeah, it's free the stories are free to read on their website, and then they compile best of collections.
Mhm.
I was in the first one with
Oh, nice.
Lord of the Brass Host. Yeah, so
Belated congratulations on that. That's cool.
well, thank you,
Uh,
thank you.
so, um, okay, yeah, no, that sounds great. Unless I'm interrupting you and you have more to share. But
No, no, no problem.
okay, no, okay, good. I guess I actually hope to get into Heroic Fantasy Quarterly someday. We'll see if that ever happens. But so but I can recommend you go if if you didn't already pause this video 5 minutes in to go and check out Dariel's stories here, Orhan, particular, or anything else for that matter. So, anyways, thank you again. I really appreciate you coming on here. And I guess we'll just say ta-ta for the audience for now. So,
Well, thank you very much, DM.
yeah, thank you.